Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Thursday, February 20th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Texas game in 191 days, the game against Michigan in 282 days. If you are planning your next event, well, you should make it unforgettable with Grateful Griddle, Columbus's favorite food truck serving up smash burgers, gourmet sandwiches, and good vibes. Book your catering today at GratefulGriddleOH.com. On today's show, we're going to be talking about the Ohio State defensive end position. Buckeyes lost three veteran players, from that defensive end rotation: JT Tuimoloau, Jack Sawyer, and Mitchell Melton. They've got feeling pretty good, I think, about the top two guys in the rotation there that are going to be replacing those departing starters. But man, behind that, there are some question marks. So, Tony, let's start with the two guys who I think probably you and me and everyone else is probably feeling relatively confident in: Kenyatta Jackson, Caden Curry. Those are both guys who took on bigger roles this year. Kenyatta Jackson in particular, man, did he come on strong this year. It feels like in terms of just the starting two defensive ends, Ohio State's going to be feeling pretty good about things heading into the 2025 spring ball.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about two guys in Caden Curry and Kenyatta Jackson who are basically the backups the last two seasons. So they've been preparing and getting ready and showing what they can do. And I think everybody's excited to see what they can do with a full complement of reps. And even writing about this on Monday, I think I called these two guys the free space on the bingo board. Basically, when you're talking about what's going to happen at defensive end, Caden Curry had 22 tackles last year. Kenyatta Jackson 16. They both had three and a half tackles for loss, couple of sacks, in some spare playing time in some of those games. But yeah, I'm fascinated to see what happens with their production, their playing time. And really how, I guess, all of these guys, and maybe it's something we can talk about later, how all of these guys fit into new defensive coordinator Matt Patricia's scheme, though I'm not expecting too much different than what we were seeing towards in the second half of last season.
Yeah, and that's something I was going to get to a little later, but let's just get to it right now, because Patricia, you have seen him play a bunch of different fronts, and I talked to Ross Fulton about this on one of the shows last week. But he uses some odd fronts. It's not just the four down that you sort of saw for Ohio State from about 2014 on until, about middle of last season, pretty consistently. You did see some different looks up front. And while I think you're going to see, I mean, what's the expectation going into the spring? Is it going to be sort of a continuation of the back half of the 2024 season? Is it going to be different from that? Is it going to be a return with a V to the 4 down look, 4 down, 1 gap? I mean, like what's the expectation?
Well, I mean, I think you'll continue to see some multiple stuff, but Ohio State's not really equipped to go to like a 3-4 or a 3-3. Like they don't have the defensive ends. They don't have like 3-4 defensive ends. They've got 4-3 defensive ends, which are, that's what they've always had. Like the 3-4 defensive ends are more like, like a Draymond Jones playing defensive end rather than 3 tech. And they don't really have those guys. They've got the guys who are, 260 pounds, 250 pounds rather than 280 pounds. So I think what you'll see is they'll certainly do some interesting things. And Larry Johnson has had no issue putting those 260 pound guys on the interior for passing downs in the rushman package. But I am interested to see if in some of those 3 down sets, who is the guy that is on the edge in terms of, is it a linebacker? Is it the CJ Hicks? Is it a Sonny Styles? Like, what are they doing along with those 3 down linemen? And I do expect them to be multiple, because I think you have to be nowadays, especially when you want to get as many guys as playing time as you can. But we'll know more when we see it in fall camp, because what are we going to see in spring camp that we can really say, oh, so that's what the defense is going to be? That's way too early.
Tony, the question of the spring: will we see the Jack? The answer: almost certainly not. Question mark? Probably not. I mean, no more than we have in previous seasons, I guess. So yeah, it's interesting because you could, if you were going to go to a real true 3-4, you could say, like, well, maybe they do have a 3-4 defensive end on the team, and his name is Edric Houston, but you just have to kick him back out from 3 tech to a 3-4 defensive end. They have guys who could do that, and you've got Caden McDonald who could play the nose in a 3-4, but you don't necessarily have the depth of pieces that you would need to do that. So, there is a way you could be having the Edric Houston as a defensive end conversation and lump him in the show, or to your point, you could lump CJ Hicks into the show because he could. I think there's a decent possibility we see CJ Hicks coming off the edge, but we'll discuss him in the linebacker show for now, and then be ready to have an oh my goodness, can you believe CJ Hicks is with the defensive line now show? Potentially 2 practices into spring. We'll see how that goes. But on to the next kind of subset of guys in that defensive end rotation, and these are 2 guys who have been on campus for a year or 2. Josh Mickens, Dominic Kirks. Kirks showed up during the summer last year, and really that sort of sets you back. So he didn't not have a huge impact first season. Josh Mickens, you saw a little bit more, but he's someone who's really going to have to. Both of those guys really are guys who are going to have to step up, because now you've gone from you're in that third team kind of group of defensive ends to now you're probably in the 2 deep or fighting for a spot in the 2 deep, and that means you got to be ready to play, and that's going to be a big step forward for both of those guys.
For sure. You're talking about those 2 guys are the next most experienced returners other than Caden Curry and Kenyatta Jackson. And they combined for like 32 snaps last year. And I think Dominic Kirks had like 5 or 7 of them, and Josh Mickens had the rest. And there's not a lot of playing time between those 2 guys, but now there's a huge opportunity for them to blossom. And it'll be interesting to see like how big is Dominic Kirks now as well, because he's a guy that came in at like 255 pounds. Is this a guy that eventually becomes a 3 tech or, Tom, a 3-4 defensive end? Because he is a big guy. And I remember talking to Larry Johnson many years ago about Draymond Jones was coming in off of like an ACL or a broken leg from a basketball injury as a true freshman. I'm like, so where do you see him? He's like, no idea until he gets in here, and we see how big he gets once he's ready to go. And you saw he pretty much, he was a freshman All-American as a redshirt freshman on the interior because he was, he was a terror. But these 2 guys, I'm fascinated to see what they can do, and if they can hold off the guys behind the new guys, and I'm sure one in particular that we'll talk about.
Yeah, well, that new guy who's not entirely a new guy, he's not new to college football, he's just new to college football in Columbus, Ohio. That would be Logan George. He's a transfer from Idaho State, which is not exactly a parallel move or a lateral move from Idaho State to Ohio State. It's kind of, to me, a question mark. Like, he was a productive player, but that's at the FCS level. And then the question is, okay, how does that translate to the FBS level, and not just the FBS level, but the high power conference level? But he's someone who they're going to probably have to lean on a little bit, because this is kind of outside of potential linebacker kind of moves or a defensive tackle moving out to defensive end. This is the end of guys who have stepped on a college football playing field conversation. Names in terms of this whole conversation. Yeah,
Logan George leaving the potato state for the potato chip state, as we all know, Ohio. That is the state bird is the potato chip. Logan George, 56 tackles last year, 18.5 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, a bunch of quarterback hurries. And it'll be interesting to see where he starts out in spring practice and where he ends up. And you say the same thing for fall camp as well. But also, he's a guy that I would expect, like, what does his season look like? Where you're going to get better and better as the season goes, but also you're playing easier competition earlier in the season generally. Now, opening with Texas is kind of not quite that, but how much better does he get over the course of the season? And then by the end of the season, is he one of your 3 best? Is he in the full rotation at that point? Because I kind of think they need him to be, based on the depth and the experience that they have. And I don't think they would have gone into the portal for him if they didn't think that he could be that, or that they needed it. They definitely need it.
Yeah, they definitely need it. And just the fact that they went into the portal for him is kind of intriguing, because it's, that's Idaho State is not exactly a transfer portal pipeline school for Ohio State. And, you might think, like with Philip Daniels, for example, the right tackle who was at Minnesota, but he's an Ohio guy. Okay, is Logan George an Ohio guy? No, Pocatello, Idaho, which is not really any closer to Ohio State or Columbus than Idaho State is. So, this is someone who they kind of went in and looked at and went, okay, this is this is someone who really does potentially fit and could be an impact player, or at least certainly a rotational player this year. So that's going to be a fascinating thing to watch. And we'll probably do a show at some point on, the guys with the most on the line, or the guys with the most potentially to gain this spring. I think he's going to be on that list for me, because boy, if he shows he can stand up to Big Ten sized offensive tackles, boy, that could be an enormous addition for this team. But you don't know until you see it. So we'll be watching that one this spring. Two other guys who are coming in as true freshmen this year. Let's start with Zion Grady. He came in from Alabama. That's a state that Ohio State has not pulled in a recruit, a high school football player from the state of Alabama since at least 1981, and quite possibly before that, because the guy from 1981, the story's a little murky there. So this is a spot where Ohio State goes in. They have really not had any real history there, and they pull Zion Grady out, and he's someone who, he's a bigger dude, so he could potentially be someone who's at least getting some reps earlier, because you don't necessarily have that, hey, you got to take a year or so to develop physically before you're ready to step on the field.
Yeah, he's already Ohio State lists him at 6'4", 240, but that's like the recruiting site list. So it'll be interesting to see when there finally is a spring roster in about, I don't know, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, when we get to see the current heights and weights and measurements. It's always a great day. The new phone books are here, that sort of thing. And I'll be interested to see where he is. And because there are some guys like Josh Mickens, for instance, was listed at 225, 230 his freshman year. And you knew that's going to take some time just to get him where they want him. And I think Zion Grady's closer to that. And, he's a productive high schooler, which is it's always kind of fishy when you see these guys who are 4 or 5 star guys at defensive end, and they had, 3.5 tackles for loss. And it's why? What is it that, is he just a camp guy? Because if he's just a camp guy, then that's a concern. But he's definitely not been that. He's close to 100 tackles a season as a defensive end in high school. So he's tenacious. I think he's got a pretty good chance to play. You ran a bonus episode of the Skull Session, Mark Givler's Skull Session recruiting podcast, where he and I talked about the 5 freshmen who could have the biggest impact. And Zion Grady was one of my 5, and he was just outside of Mark's 5, but wanted to put him in there, but it felt he had to put an offensive guy in there just because and knock Grady out. But I think he's got an opportunity to go ahead and make some noise this year.
Yeah, and in addition to being physically maybe kind of a little more ready to step on the field early and contribute early, he also has the advantage of being already in Columbus. That is an enormous difference in terms of your likelihood of playing and being a meaningful contributor in your true freshman year. Virtually everyone in this class, I think there are only 3 exceptions, virtually everyone is already on campus. But the last guy we're going to be talking about, Tuimoloau, he is not. Now, he was a late flip from UCLA, and he is going to be enrolling in June. He's someone that, when I talked to Larry Johnson about him, Larry Johnson was really excited about him, thinks he could be a really, really special player down the line. But when you're coming in as a true freshman and you're enrolling mid-year, that kind of puts you a little bit behind the 8 ball in terms of being able to contribute in year 1.
Yeah, and he's also a guy that probably needs to get bigger in terms of adding weight. You look at his senior games, his highlights, and you can see he's going to need to get bigger. He's got a decent frame for sure. I mean, he's listed at 6'4", 225, but that's I'm sure he's going to be heavier when he arrives than that, so he'll be closer to playing time. But we talk every year about this 5-star guy, this 4-star guy, but they're not going to be in here till June. So that's, just go ahead and put mark him as a likely red shirt at that point. And especially when you're talking about a team that has as much talent as Ohio State does, it's going to be difficult to get on the field for some of these guys, even with some of the lack of depth that we've talked about. But here, I don't know that you need to redshirt him, but if it happens, I wouldn't be shocked. Just so you're not wasting, quote unquote, wasting a year, putting him out there when maybe he's not ready. And Larry Johnson's always talking about with his freshmen, he only wants them to play in situations where they can be successful. So that kind of narrows things down, especially for a June enrollee.
For sure. Yeah, that feels like that's always sort of one of those things that we look back and after the year, it's like, why did this guy not play as much? It's like, well, he showed up in June, and that just makes such a difference. And it's one of the reasons that the early enrollee thing is kind of now just sort of the on time enrollee. That was such a groundbreaking thing when it first started 20 something years ago. Maurice Claret's the first guy I can remember doing that, and it was such a groundbreaking thing. And now it's just everyone does it except for a small handful of guys, and usually it's something where your high school doesn't let you graduate early or something like that. So it is definitely the exception. We will see the rest of the guys though this spring. Should be a really that's going to be one of the many interesting positional battles to watch. Where, as Tony said earlier, you feel like you know who the starters are, but man, everything behind that, man, that's going to be interesting to watch how that thing all sorts itself out, and then potentially do they go into the portal and bring in someone else after the spring, or do they feel like they're content and happy with where they are? So we'll be following all of that stuff and plenty more positional battles as well, all at BuckeyeHuddle.com all spring long. That's where Tony, Kevin, and I cover the team. Mark covers recruiting. We got our whole team of X's and O's gurus there as well to make you a smarter football fan. That's all at BuckeyeHuddle.com. We hope to see you there. That'll do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.